and welcome to Learn with the Lords Question Time. You're joining us today in the River Room in the Houses of Parliament, and I'm joined by an expert panel of members of the House of Lords, and very excitingly also by a live student audience from Benton Park School in Leeds, and we're going to be hearing from them a little bit later. So today's event is in two parts. The first 30 minutes is going to be a panel discussion based on the question, how effective is the House of Lords in scrutinising the government? After that, we're going to hear all of your fantastic questions that you've submitted and questions from our students present in the room. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves and we will start today's panel discussion. So we'll start this end.
Hello, Philip Norton. I'm Lord Norton of Louth. I'm Professor of Government at the University of Hull. I specialise in Parliament and more broadly constitutional issues. And I've been a life peer since 1998, so I both study Parliament but also work within it.
I'm Sue Garden, Baroness Garden of Frognall. I was appointed in 2007 as a Liberal Democrat peer to speak mainly on education. My late husband was in the Royal Air Force and we moved 24 times in 30 years, so my career is pretty well non-existent. But I did drift into teaching and I worked for City and Guilds, a vocational awarding body, and so I've always been passionate particularly about vocational qualifications. But once you're in the Lords, you can speak about almost anything.
Thank you.
I'm David Anderson, Lord Anderson of Ipswich. I'm a barrister. For 6 years I was the reviewer of the terrorism laws. Somebody encouraged me to apply to the House of Lords, so I filled in the form, attached a CV and the names of 6 referees, and 3 years later in 2018 I was appointed. I sit on the crossbenches as an independent peer.
I'm Debbie Wilcox, Baroness Wilcox of Newport. I've been here since November 2019. I came in on November the 4th, which was the 185th anniversary of the Chartist uprising in Newport. So I chose that day specifically.
Fantastic. Right, so how effective is the House of Lords in scrutinising the government? I'm going to start by turning to Lord Norton for some opening thoughts on that question.
Well, I think my basic proposition is that the House of Lords does an effective job but could do it better. And I think we need to distinguish forms of scrutiny or what we're scrutinising. We need to scrutinise the legislation the government brings forward. I think that is first and foremost our task, to make sure that law is as good as it can be. That is absolutely fundamental. My starting point is that good law is a public good. We've got to make sure it's as effective as it can be before it's enacted. So what we do matters, because it matters to everybody, because law shapes what you can do, what you're not allowed to do. So it's fundamental we focus on that, and I would say that is our core task. Qualitatively and quantitatively. So because of its importance, it takes up most of our time. But then there's actually scrutinising the actions and policies of government. So what's it doing? What's it proposing to do? Do we have mechanisms in place? And I think we do a good job. It's partly to do with composition, well, in large part to do with composition of the House, but also the mechanisms at our disposal. Because if you look at composition, there are two elements. The political composition, by which I mean no one party has an absolute majority in the House of Lords. I think that's absolutely crucial, because it means the government has to take the House seriously to get measures through in a way it does not necessarily have to do with the House of Commons. I think we add value because we are qualitatively distinctive. We're different from the Commons in composition, and that affects how we go about our work. So in the House of Commons, I would say there's a culture of assertion. The government knows it can carry, and sort of the two sides argue with one another. Quite appropriate, that's what they're there to do. So we hear one side's view, the other side's view, they argue, but they're not really necessarily engaging. In the Lords, it's a culture of justification. Government's got to come forward, it's got to explain what it's doing to justify it. And I think that really is core to what we're doing. So political composition matters, but individual composition matters. So the individual members of the House, why they're here. Essentially a House of experience and expertise. We attract controversy occasionally, we get some members who don't fit in either category, but overwhelmingly they do. So they're either here because of the jobs they've held, Cabinet Secretary, Chief of the Defence Staff, leading some great trade union, charity or other organisation, or because of expertise. They're the leading experts in the field. So they can scrutinise a measure in a way that you won't get anywhere else. So I think those come together to enable us to scrutinise very effectively. But I think we benefit from our procedures as well. We're a self-regulating house, which again makes us distinctive. But we've got opportunities to explore. We can raise issues, we can initiate debates. And with legislation, we're not constricted in the way the House of Commons is. We don't have timetable motions, so bills are not timetabled. We will debate for as long as we need to. There's no selection of amendments in the House of Commons. The occupant of the chair selects which amendments will be debated. Here, you put an amendment down, it's debated. So even if there are several hundred amendments put down to a bill, and that does happen, they'll all be debated. And we get the opportunity as well to really pursue it, because we can take amendments on the third reading of a bill. So it's not just committee and report, anything still unresolved, very few, but it can still be on third reading. So we have opportunities denied MPs, and in a way our speaking opportunities are great, who are self-regulating, and get up and contribute, or set piece debates you sign up in advance, but you don't have to rely on somebody to recognise you and call you to speak. If we want to speak, we speak. So I think there are a number of factors that are specific to the House that really facilitates us doing that job. But I think we could do it better. We need to improve our input legitimacy, those as they come into the House. People we get tend to be very good, but we need to ensure there's quality control. And so, if you like, up the current procedures on composition. We need to affect not only how people get here, but how many we've got once they're here. We are too big. We need to slim our numbers. We recognise that. The House is all in favour of reform. The government tends to be the problem in getting it initiated. So there's more we could do looking at the input side, the membership. There's more we can do on the output, the work we do. So I've mentioned the, if you like, the plus features, but I think we could refine our procedures. We've reformed recently our committee structure, but there are other things I'd like to see us do, and areas we might wish to move into that would play to our strengths. We focus on the bill going through. We're not greatly involved in pre-legislative scrutiny. The political system would benefit enormously from more consistent pre-legislative scrutiny. At the moment, it's in the gift of government. And the other area, which I've been advocating as well for some time, which I'm glad to see has been taken up, but quite often by parliaments around the globe, is post-legislative scrutiny. Because it used to be the case that legislative success was measured in terms of getting a bill through. So for a minister, oh, I've got the bill on the statute book, success. Well, no, success should be measured in terms of whether the act actually does what you expect it to do. So actually looking at an act some years after enactment to check, has it actually delivered or not? We've done some of that. It can be very effective, for example, in the area of public health, mental health legislation, which was subject to post-legislative review, found to be not delivering what was expected. So there's been amending legislation. So I think there are areas we could move into and that would play to our strengths. So I think we need to look at how we're composed, how many of us there are, but are our structures and procedures. As I say, I think we do a good job. Law in this nation is better as a consequence of the work of the House than otherwise it would be. But I think we could do it even better. And I think that is a public good. Everyone would benefit, because what we do matters. It affects the public. It affects everyone.
Thank you very much, Lord Morton. So that's a really good introduction to a lot of different topics there. Sue, you look like you wanted to come in.
Well, yes, and I think one of the reasons we're effective is that we are a very courteous House. We listen to each other, unlike the Commons, who think it's clever to bay each other down. And I think that makes a difference. And we have a very, very wide membership. Although there are over 800 of us, there are probably only about 400 who come regularly. So we're not as big in theory as we look. But of course, Philip's touched on all sorts of things, and he is the past master at this. So I would hope we are effective in scrutinising. The hours and hours we spend scrutinising legislation, you know, if we weren't effective, we'd just all go home and give up, I think, because we're very often here very late at night, and I think that's, in theory, we sit from 2:30 till 10 o'clock at night. 10 can often be 11 or midnight. You honestly aren't doing your best work at midnight. But each time we make any attempts to change that, it gets voted down by people who say, oh, no, it's always worked very well before.
And they're never here at midnight.
No, yeah, oh, we did have that, yes, because we had an attempt to change our working hours from 1 to 8:30, and it was voted down by people. So the next time that we were all in the chamber at 10, I think it was one of your colleagues, Debbie, who looked around and said, where are all the people who said they wanted to be here at 10? Because none of them were. So it's all very well for other people to work till hours. But yes, I think we can be very effective. Philip's touched on the appointment system, and of course the fact that a Prime Minister can appoint as many people to the House as he or she chooses is a real bad thing to do.
And of course what we are is a second chamber. And you could take the question almost back a bit and say, do we need a second chamber in this country? Because there are plenty of very serious countries that have just one chamber in their legislature. In Scotland, for example, the Scottish Parliament. It has committees, like the House of Commons has, but once a bill has got through the Scottish Parliament, and you've just seen the recent Gender Recognition Act, for example, that's it. There's nobody else to have another look at it. And I rather like what Meg Russell had to say about this, who, like Philip Norton, is a great expert on parliaments. And she said recently, second chambers mean second thoughts. And if you like evidence-based policy making, then you like them. And it seems to me that the first thing we bring, and it's nothing to do with any of our merits or the way we're appointed or anything, we just bring a bit of time. Because once bills have gone through the Commons, they have to sit here until we've gone through second reading, committee, report stage, third reading. And often things happen in that time. I'll take the example of a bill that's going through at the moment, the National Security Bill. I happen to think a very, very important and very necessary bill. But added onto it was a scheme which popped up halfway through the passage of the bill through the Commons, and was only finalised on the last day that the bill was in the Commons before it came to us. And this is a thing called a foreign influence registration scheme, which says that if you're a foreign government, or if you're a company or a charity or any organisation incorporated abroad, and you have dealings of any kind with the British government, then you have to register, unless you fall within a few very limited exceptions. And they didn't have time to think about this in the Commons. And most of us read the bill and thought, well, we'll get onto that when we need to. And then all of a sudden, people started popping up. So the City of London started popping up and saying, but you know, foreign banks are talking all the time to the business department or to the competition authority or whatever it might be. And the charities popped up and said, well, we're always trying to persuade the British government to redirect its aid where we're working in sub-Saharan Africa. And all sorts of people said, will it be confidential? We talk to people and we don't really want everyone to know. And we're from France and we're from Denmark and we're from Canada and we're not a threat to your national security. And it just takes a bit of time for all those people to come from under their stones and come from out of the woodwork. And then people like us who are sitting in the House of Lords have time to talk to these people, to read what they say, to talk. In my case, I'm a crossbencher, so I can't do anything without political support. So I probably make a beeline for Labour, Liberal Democrats, and the people who really matter are the government, because the best thing is if you can get the government to agree that something needs to be done. And I offer you the prediction that something will happen to the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, and it will end up a lot better than it came to us. And I think a lot of bills just end up better when we've finished with them than they were when they came to us. I'd love to say that was all because we're such brilliant people, but the reality is, as the others have said, some of us might be, some of us are not. We're a pretty rum lot, frankly. And some of the ways we get here, I don't think you can begin to defend. I mean, the idea that there should be places here open only to hereditary peers, people whose fathers or grandfathers or great-grandfathers became peers, all of whom, incidentally, are male, every single one of them, I think it's utterly ludicrous. I don't feel sorry for the hereditary peers. Some of them, rather annoyingly, are so good that they will get in through any meritocratic appointment procedure. So I don't defend the appointment process, but I think those second thoughts are really helpful, and I think that we do produce evidence-based policy making, and I think the combination of the political members and the discipline that the political structure gives us, and a few crossbenchers who've got expertise in particular subjects, I think is a good model. And although I'm all for reform of the House of Lords, I do hope we keep that combination going forward.
it's been fascinating listening to what my fellow Lords have said, and I kind of come at it from a political angle, because as well as being a teacher for a long time, I was also a local councillor, and then I led Newport City Council. So I come with that local government background and the education background, and you can guess by the accent, I'm from Wales. So my primary focus is Wales and Welsh matters, and I sit on the shadow front bench doing that. And sometimes I feel a bit like an evangelist when I go home to Wales to try to explain to colleagues in local government and others in the Labour Party what I'm doing here and what the House of Lords is about. Because the absence of understanding and knowledge of our work is frankly frightening, because I've been here 3 years and 3 months, and I've learned so much in that time. Obviously, we've had the pandemic, but we were working online. And, I was talking earlier to Lord Anderson, and we were talking about how we picked up the technology really quickly, because, I'm at the lower end of the old age group, but
we are mostly very old.
But somebody said to me, "Oh, you have a great advantage when you go to the Lords, Debbie, because you know how to use Google," and it was true. But how many colleagues picked up that ability to use, because we were working online and we were working remotely, and so the House of Lords continued to work, and it really was amazing how that technology was just seamlessly absorbed. And that's
unlike the Commons.
Unlike the Commons, yes, we did what they didn't do, and it is being surrounded by that expertise. I would disagree, Sue. I think it's about 300 people here regularly rather than 400. It's that same,
yes.
It's that same crowd. And so this myth of 800 in the Lords, and yes, we do need to be reduced, and we do need to be reviewed and revised and changed. But we whatever it is, we need a second chamber. I am more convinced of that than ever.
Thank you very much. So I wonder if we could delve a bit more deeply into the different types of scrutiny, so that we're linking really closely to our politics A-level students watching. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about the select committee process, particularly in the House of Lords, but maybe with a comparison with the Commons if we can. Lord Norton, I might come to you first on that one, if that's okay.
Yes, and I think as a prelude to bear in mind two types of committee structure: select committees looking at policy areas, and those committees that deal with legislation, which in our case primarily means delegated legislation, because a bill will go to a committee of the whole House or in grand committee. So we don't have dedicated committees that a bill will go through, to which members are appointed. It's either in the chamber or in grand committee. So any member of the Lords can participate in the committee stage of a bill. So if your expertise relates to a particular part, you can go in for that. You don't need to be there for another part. So you're not sort of press gang serving as in the Commons on a public bill committee. So it draws in those members who want to participate and have an expertise. So it can be just a very small number of peers, but they're the ones who know about that subject and come along. I mean, the National Security Bill strikes me as a particularly good example, because then the people speaking on that really know about the subject, and it's fairly clear that they do.
Just give you an example of that, which also shows you how independent a lot of people are here. One of the other proposals in the bill, some of us didn't like very much, was to give an immunity to members of the intelligence agencies for certain crimes that if they were anybody else, they could be prosecuted for. And the government thought this was a good idea, and they tried to soften a few of us up along these lines. And then we got to a debate in the House, and Eliza Manningham-Buller, who was Director General of MI5 in the years after 9/11, so when the terrorist threat was at its worst, stood up and said, well, I don't see any justification for giving members of the security services immunity from laws that apply to everybody else. And I thought, well, at that moment, that clause just went down the plug hole, because someone independent, we say without fear or favour, had just stood up and said what she thought. Sorry, Philip, I didn't mean to interrupt. But it's an example of what...
Yes, exactly. So that's committee stage. That's the value of the committees dealing with bills or with bills. Now, it's very different with secondary legislation, because we do have dedicated committees dealing with delegated legislation. And that, again, adds value to the Commons, because the Commons don't have committees dealing with delegated legislation, because secondary legislation, delegated legislation isn't politically sexy. It's not going to attract interest of members of the Commons. There's no political mileage. So we focus on that. We have committees that really do great work, both in terms of the input side, which is the inclusion in bills of provision for order making, in other words, delegated legislation, and the output side. So we have a committee that looks at orders once they're made and reports to the House. But then we do have dedicated committees looking at subject areas. Now, you're doubtless aware the House of Commons has departmental select committees. So for every government department, there's a House of Commons select committee scrutinising it. So we don't do that. There's no point duplicating what the Commons has. So we go for essentially what are cross-cutting issues, not confined to particular departments, so the Constitution, economic affairs and so on. And we also, in addition, so those are what are known as sessional committees, permanent committees in effect, we also appoint what we now call investigative committees, but essentially temporary committees just for a year to investigate particular topics we think are important that merit scrutiny. So we do that as well. So we have dedicated committees which are designed not to duplicate the Commons, but to add value by looking at areas that they won't be able to cover. And coming back to the earlier point about composition, here it's not like the Commons where now the whole House elects the chairs of select committees and the parties elect the members. Here it's still appointed by the House, but it comes back to my point about composition. Members are selected to serve because their expertise or experience in that particular field. So the Science and Technology Committee will have people on who are scientists, know about all about technology and so on. You look at economic affairs, so it's former chancellors of the Exchequer, people who have served as the civil servants in the Treasury, people like that, or international economists. Constitution Committee, I was the first chair of the Constitution Committee, comprises people who have served as Lord Chancellor, Lord Chief Justice, some of our leading lawyers or served in senior governmental positions. So we appoint people on the basis they know what they're talking about. So it means that it's an informed committee, which also means it can really engage with witnesses, because you know who to call, and when they come, they recognise the quality of the committee. So you get really good engagement, because my view is committee members need to know the subject to engage with the witnesses, because it's not just knowing to ask questions, because you can be briefed on what question to ask, it's being able immediately to evaluate the quality of the answers that you get and to engage. So we are qualitatively distinctive. Again, it comes back to the key point about the relationship between the two chambers. You can't understand the Lords without reference to the Commons. That shapes how we proceed. We recognise the Commons is the primary chamber. We accept that. We work within it, so we seek to add value to it by doing things that, fulfilling tasks, it doesn't have the time, or for that matter, the political will to carry out. So I think that's why we're valuable. We serve to complement the Commons, not to conflict with it or to duplicate it. And I think that's reflected in the nature of our committee structure.
But one of the things, Debbie was saying, that we are fairly triumphant when we defeat the government, which we do on a regular basis because there's no government majority in the Lords. But they then always has to go back to the Commons because the Commons always have the last word.
But worth making the point, I think, that most amendments that are carried in the Lords are without a division. Only about 2% of, amendments carried.
And although they might look like government amendments because they go forward in the name of the minister,
yes.
the reality is they had their origins in somebody making a fuss and then the minister beginning to see actually they've got a point.
And I think that's important to understanding the process because key to understanding Parliament, I mean, I've done a lot of work recently on informal space in Parliament because the focus normally is on public space, what happens in the chamber and in committee rooms. So it's formal, it's measurable, which is what political scientists tend to focus on. But so much is what goes on away from the chamber, either members mixing informally or meeting informally with ministers. So you've got committee stage, members put down amendments to press a point. The minister will say, well, I'm not sure about this. If you withdraw it, we'll think about it. And then after committee stage, they meet with a peer to discuss it. Can we reach some agreement if we we'll bring forward the amendment because parliamentary counsel, those who, the lawyers who draft bills, will draft it in correct legal form. We'll bring it forward at report stage if we reach agreement. So you have almost an informal stage between committee and report stage. That's the productive stage, where you meet the minister, their officials, you talk about the particular amendment to see if agreement can be reached. And then, as Lord Anderson just indicated, the minister brings forward the amendment. It's a government amendment, but it's in response to points that have been raised earlier. So normally at report stage you can get a lot of government amendments. Ultimately, if it's still not resolved, as I mentioned, we can take amendments at third reading and the Commons can't. So we do have the opportunity really to pursue it. And quite often it is fairly constructive. Ministers on the whole do listen. And even if on occasion you don't win the vote, sometimes you feel satisfied, well, at least I've won the argument. And that's a great thing about the Chamber, being able to make your case. Because to be honest, it's fairly obvious when someone's won the argument, even if the government actually wins.
That's what you mean by a culture of justification.
Yes, exactly.
And it can't be much fun being a minister being asked to defend the indefensible. You can probably brazen it out fine in the Commons because they're all roaring like jackals behind you. But in the Lords, you've got all these clever people just very politely but icily explaining why you're wrong.
Yes.
And as someone who's relatively new here, I'm actually surprised by how influential the Lords is. Because of course, if we get into an arm wrestle with the Commons, I know about the Parliament Acts and all the rest of it, but it never even really gets that far. We can play ping pong with them for a couple of rounds, we insist and then they insist back, and we all know at the end we've got to let them win because they're democratically elected. But we still seem to have enough of a sort of reasonable culture in our politics. I know things have got a bit ugly and gone a bit to the extremes, but people actually do still listen. And I'd say we don't have power, but we do have influence. And I had to talk, I think with Becca, to a primary school recently, 10-year-olds, about the role of the House of Lords. And I said to my wife, how am I going to explain the House of Lords to 10-year-olds? And she thought a bit and she said, well, you could put it like this. The House of Commons are like your parents. They basically make the rules. And they tell you when you have to go to bed and who you can play with and all the rest of it. But if you're lucky, as a family, then you'll have grandparents somewhere in the background as well. And they are older, a lot older. I mean, look at us.
Speak for yourself.
Sometimes they know a bit more. They might have expertise that the parents don't. And above all, they've got time. And that doesn't mean they get to make the decisions, but it does mean that very often they're listened to and they're influenced. And I find often, particularly when you're talking, say, to a young minister, ministers look very young these days, and you're trying to persuade them of something and they come up with a suggestion and you say, you're going to find that's very difficult to get through the Lords, and they look anxious. They don't quite understand all of them, what it is that we do, but they know that we're very old and we can make life very difficult for them, and we have this majestic palace that we live in. And very often they will start thinking, well, perhaps there's another way. So I would put it in terms of influence.
Yes.
The only problem I've realised with your analogy is it assumes the parents were always arguing.
Oh, it's a modern family. Yes.
Parents can hand the child back as well.
Just before we wrap up the discussion, we've talked about legislating, we've talked about committees. I just want to talk really briefly about questions, if that's okay, before we then open to questions from all of you and for people watching. Lady Wilcox, could you perhaps share some thoughts on question time in the Lords and why it's so important, do you think?
It absolutely is. I mean, I was doing the shadow front bench today for Lord Tewig was asking a question about autism. He's a great advocate for that specialism, and so I then had to leap up and ask the minister about the publication of the Send review, which still hasn't been published. So it's 10 minutes per question, and it's the opportunity for anyone to ask supplementary questions from the original questioner. And it really does bring in that chance for you to have that opportunity to put the minister on the spot. You have to stick to the subject, although sometimes some people don't, but essentially you should. So as I said, I did the autism one today, and next week I've got my own question coming in where I'm going to put the minister on the spot about the lack of the second railway line to South Wales that they've published, that they promised for years and years and years. And it really, transport is such an important aspect. So whatever they say, it'll be in the public record. And question time, you don't go in when we were in the pandemic, we had a list. So we would have a list of 10 people asking the supplementary questions. And some people wanted to keep that. We talked earlier about things wanting to be kept because they thought it was a fairer way of people having the opportunity to speak, because you have to leap up and say, my lords, and then it's usually the person with the loudest voice gets it. And actually, we saw, the data showed that when we did it on a list basis, that more women members were engaging in question time, and I think, you know, that was a positive thing. So I was an advocate for keeping the list, so there would be a fairer balance, but there we are.
Thank you. Have we got any further comments on questions
we don't
in
want
the
to
chamber?
keep the list. It's much more fun. In coalition government, I was government whip and minister in coalition government, which was very exciting for a Lib Dem. But my first portfolio was I was the Minister for Olympics, Sport and Media. My daughters thought this was hilarious. They had never known me take any interest in sport whatsoever. But actually, you had to work all the harder. And the work that we put in to try and make sure if we were asked a question, we had actually researched it to make sure. And I always went and asked the questioner, what would you really like to, we're here to be helpful, what would you really like to hear in my answer? And by and large, they would then explain a bit, and they would, if I was lucky, they would give me what their supplementary question was. Because as Debbie says, you have no idea where the questions are coming from and who they're coming from. And so if you've got a little bit of warning, that doesn't half help to get your mind round it. But as I say, there were 3 Lib Dems and 5 Conservatives. The 5 Conservatives were all paid ministerial salaries. They'd run out of ministerial salaries for the 3 of us, so we were unpaid. But, you know, we were so excited to be in government. We worked our socks off to do that. And it always seemed to me that the point of what ministers should be trying to do is make sure they really are answering Lords' questions effectively.
Well, it comes back to the earlier point about composition and procedure, because, I mean, the peers know what they're talking about on the specific issue. I mean, Lord Young of Cookham, who was previously an MP and served in government in both the Commons and the Lords, regularly makes the point that when he was in the Commons, he was well briefed and he felt he knew more about the subject than the people questioning him. When he was in the Lords, it was the other way round, because he knew whoever was putting the question were the experts. And the other thing has been mentioned, is the time factor. The Commons goes for breadth, trying to get through as many questions as possible in the time. We go for depth, so you're guaranteed 10 minutes is quite long enough for peers to come in, so you know if a minister's not really on top of their brief.
Thank you very much. So we'll have to conclude the discussion there, but now it's the moment of truth, everyone. It's over to you for your questions. I'm going to give you a little bit of breathing time and ask a question that's been pre-submitted by a school first. So we'll start with one from Trinity Sixth Form College in Halifax. So I hope you're watching. Thanks so much for this one. And that question is, can you give us a recent example of the House of Lords holding the government to account? We've heard a few in the discussion, so maybe if we can think of a new one, that would be fantastic. I might come to Lord Anderson for this one, if that's all right.
Right, well, what shall we start with? I'll give you an example of another law that we looked at as it was going through. It's called the Nationality and Borders Act. And one of the things it did, had a lot in it about immigration, but it also had something about removing people's citizenship from them, which is something the Home Secretary does have the power to do, particularly if she thinks they're a terrorist or something like that. She can actually say, you're not a British citizen anymore. She can really only say it if you're a dual national. And someone at the Home Office thought it would be a jolly good idea to let her do this without actually telling the person they are having their citizenship removed. So Clause 9 of the bill said she can do it without telling you. And I saw this and I just thought I couldn't quite believe it. And I talked to a couple of other people who couldn't believe it. And I got on the radio and tried to whip up a bit of interest. And then it caught fire because dual nationals started seeing it. Influential politicians, you know, who had a different heritage started seeing it. Saida Varsi, for example, saw it, and she absolutely hit the roof. Her counterparts in other parties. It was one of these movements that gathered pace. We ended up with a petition of 300,000 people saying, how dare you, remove our citizenship? Perhaps you've already removed mine and not told us about it. And the Home Office was putting out more and more misleading press releases saying this power is only for use in the most exceptional circumstances. And I was saying, well, if your law said the same as your press release, it wouldn't be too bad, but the law allows you to do it whenever you think it's in the public interest. So eventually, some of us went to see the Home Office and said, well, so what's all this about? Why are you doing it? And they said, well, we're a bit worried if we want to remove citizenship from a jihadi who's in a camp in northeast Syria, we don't really want to have to send a courier out there because they might get their throats slit So wouldn't it be easier just to, well, all right, maybe you've got a point, but this power is much, much wider than you need. And by this stage, the pressure on the government was such, from people, from voters, whose votes they really wanted, that they basically crumbled. And they came to some of us and said, look, we'd really like you to put forward an amendment. What do you think this needs? And so we said, well, we can see a case for using it, but it has to be really exceptional, has to be controlled by a judge, have to be all these safeguards on it, and the Secretary of State's going to have to personally sign the thing. And I think basically we ended up with some amendments that meant the power does exist, but it's extremely unlikely it's ever going to be used, except maybe in the really unusual case of the guy in a terrorist camp. So that was just an example, and I don't claim all the credit as the House of Lords. I think a lot of it was the time factor and the fact that people started reading it in the way they often don't in the Commons. It's working with media, it's working with social media, it's working with groups, civil society groups out in the country, and sort of they all combine, and we can be the mouthpiece that eventually has the conversation with the minister. And of course the opposition part is very important as well. The first thing I would always do as a crossbencher, you go and see if there's opposition support, because however brilliant your crossbench idea, it's not going to win any votes if you don't have both Lib Dems and Labour on your side. And if the election goes the other way, you can reverse. So that's my example, if you like.
Thank you very much. Right, time for a question from one of our students from Benton Park. Who would like to ask the first one? Go for it, yeah.
Some have said that the House of Lords could be undemocratic. How would you retaliate this should you disagree?
Do you want to direct that to whoever you'd like to answer it? Do you not mind?
Yeah, sure.
Go to Lord Norton.
Yes, my starting point is people trot this out, the House of Lords is undemocratic, and take it as if that is self-evidently the case. I normally say to them, how are you defining democracy? And then silence. There is a democratic argument for the House of Lords, because democracy, demos kratia, rule of or by the people, is how people choose to govern themselves. So that is the key element. Citizens can't meet for direct democracy, so 60 million people can't get together at the same time to decide policy. They choose those they want to govern on their behalf. And then fundamental to that is holding those who govern to account for their stewardship. So it's about government. And in this country, we have core accountability, because through the system we have, people choose who's going to govern through elections to the House of Commons. That determines...
But they don't choose who's going to come to the House of Lords,
do they? I'll come on to, because the key point is, we're not governing, that's the key point, because who forms the government is determined by election to the Commons, and electors know that. So at the next election, there is one body, the party or parties, in government who stand before the electors to be held to account. Now, we've got the benefit of a second chamber that adds value to what the first is doing, but does not challenge that core accountability, because the Commons is able to determine the ends of legislation. We don't challenge that. We focus on the means. Can it be improved? But we don't challenge the principle. That's why we don't vote on government bills on second reading. So the government determines the programme of public policy, and has a quite good record, successive governments normally of implementing it, and then be held to account. So the second chamber doesn't get in the way of that core accountability. Now, if you start to elect a second chamber, the members will start to use the powers of that second chamber. We don't use our full powers because we accept the primacy of the Commons. Not only may they use those full powers, and they could really cause immense problems, they may demand more. Why not? They'd say, well, we're elected, probably we're more legitimate than you because of the method by which we're elected. So we want more powers, we want to be able to challenge what you're doing. So what happens then, as you get where you got to elected chambers, but if they're co-equal, deals are done. So outputs then result where electors can't hold anyone to account. Who is responsible for that particular output? Particularly deals tend to be opaque, who's responsible. There is no one body responsible for that particular outcome. So there's no core accountability. So the present system, as though we have core accountability, electors know who's responsible for the programme of public policy, while at the same time we get the benefit of value added by a second chamber without challenging that core accountability. So we, as I say, we work within that. We don't challenge the ability of the Commons, the right of the Commons to determine the ends of legislation. We focus on, as I say, the detail. So they focus on the ends, we focus on the means, and it doesn't challenge it. So you can make a democratic argument for an appointed second chamber, not for an appointed first chamber, because you need that core accountability.
It is slightly odd for a great democracy to have its second legislative chamber appointed at the whim of the Prime Minister of the day. You know, that really is an oddity.
Canada?
I was going to say,
Okay, right,
we're not unique.
All right, we're not unique.
The number of second chambers that are appointed runs into two figures.
Yes. But at the whim of the Prime Minister of the day?
It depends on the method of appointment, so we can change that. I've got a private members bill going through that to some extent would change that. So reforming the process by which members come here. But that doesn't affect the key point about your question in terms of principle. For those who might think, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I should say that my colleagues who are academic colleagues who are specialists in political philosophy developed the argument as well. One who's a specialist in democratic theory actually put that forward in evidence to the Joint Committee on the House of Lords Reform Bill back in 2012.
But in terms of democracy, the hardest thing I had to come to terms with when accepting this role was that I had to give up my right to vote, because none of us can vote in the general election. And, you know, after that hard-won fight so that women could vote, and that, you know, and that was really hard, that we can't do that anymore.
Thank you very much. Really good question. That question was also submitted by Wirral Grammar School, Deeside Sixth Form, Coleg Cambria, the Kingsley School in Leamington Spa, the City of Norwich College and Streatham and Clapham High School. So I hope that answered that for all of you. So well done you for that one. Fantastic. So, Lord Anderson, I'm going to put this next one to you. Might put you in a bit of a difficult position, but let's see. So this is from Old Palace of John Whitgift School in London and Calderstone School in Liverpool. So thank you for this one. If the House of Lords was made up entirely of peers recommended by the Independence Appointments Commission, ending nominations by the party leaders, would it be a more effective chamber in terms of scrutinising the government, do you think?
Well, funnily enough, this experiment is being conducted in Canada as we speak. The Canadian Senate is the closest, I think, chamber to the House of Lords anywhere else in the world. It was based on the House of Lords, and it was notorious for political patronage, not all of it very clean. So it wasn't much regarded by a lot of Canadians. So about 6 or 7 years ago, Trudeau had the idea of saying, let's have what we would call a crossbench house. So I will keep my power of patronage, but I can only appoint people who have been chosen, Canadians who have been applied to and been chosen by an independent appointments commission. So effectively, anyone can apply, just as I applied. They will be interviewed by this independent commission, and 5 names of appointable people are put forward every time there's a vacancy. They have to represent the regions and so on, and the Prime Minister just chooses the one that he likes. So that would be done, and you would end up, already it's more than half a crossbench house, and it will end up completely a crossbench house. Now, I'm a crossbencher. What's not to like about that? The answer is, well, I'd love to go and have a look, but I don't really see how it can work, because to me, the way the House of Lords scrutinises things as carefully as it does is all about the political structure. Now, we crossbenchers, we swan in. We have this great idea, how dare they remove people's citizenship? You know, I'm going to make a fuss, I'm going to give an interview, I shall put down an amendment, and we have our moment of glory and it all ends happily. But actually the unsung heroes of this place, I would say, are the opposition front bench spokesmen. And I don't say that because they're Labour, you know, next time they'll be Conservative. The party is irrelevant. These are the people, as far as I know, they don't even get paid anything extra. No. They sit there till midnight, you know, half the nights of the week, putting down amendments on every single clause of every bill. We call them probing amendments, just trying to work out what it actually means and why did you do it this way and not that way. There's no publicity in it for them, there's no political mileage, no one outside the House that even know they're doing it. But they do it because that's part of the political discipline of the House. And to my mind, that's very important. And if you just had a bunch of crossbenchers swanning around, great respect to crossbenchers, I don't know how you get that discipline and that rigour. So I think the combination is what makes this place worth keeping.
That's really interesting, thank you. Let's have another question from from one of our students in the room. Who would like to ask the next question? Yeah, go for it.
Are you concerned that the retained EU law bill could give excessive power to ministers and reduce Parliament's ability to scrutinise?
Interesting, right. Lady Wilcox. Come
Well,
on
I
in.
mean, I came in post the Brexit discussions and speaking to colleagues who were here during that time. I mean, you were here late into the night, early in the morning, and it was uphill and down dale. So I don't know enough about it to give you an answer in detail, as other colleagues may, but it's just that sense of undoing things that were done up and, unintended consequences, okay, is a phrase I hear quite a lot here, and I think I can attach that to your question. What's going to happen as a result that no one's even dreamt about?
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to comment on that one?
Yes, I think that is, but it's not the only bill. We've had a load of them where the government has attempted to give loads of powers to secretaries of state. And we have been fighting those tooth and nail because we don't think that a minister is here today, gone tomorrow, may not know an awful lot about the subject area, should have the last say. And we've had a number of education ones, and we've been through so many secretaries of state for education, and some of them know something about education, some of them don't. But this is wrong in principle. It should be for Parliament to have these powers, not for secretaries of state.
And the difficulty is you've got time in a year to get about 30 bills through Parliament, and in the same year you're probably going to get 2,000 or 3,000 statutory instruments, so these pieces of legislation signed by ministers under powers given to them by Acts. And a lot of us think, well, it's ridiculous that you do all these important things by statutory instrument. I think this is a terrible bill, this real bill, and I shall be fighting parts of it as hard as I can. But I think if you're mature about it, you have to think, Parliament obviously doesn't have the time to look at everything. So what systems can we devise within Parliament that allow us to at least give some sort of meaningful scrutiny to these statutory instruments? And the dirty secret, which I'm really ashamed to say, even though I'm a lawyer, I don't think I knew this until I joined this place. Neither House of Parliament has any power to amend a statutory instrument. We have a theoretical power to strike them down and say they can't be part of our law. But even that power, the House of Commons hasn't used since 1979. We haven't used since 2015, and we were more or less threatened with being blown out of the water if we ever use it again. So that really is an issue, but it's a difficult issue to solve because the sheer volume of stuff that has to go through in an advanced country is too much. Even for, even if all 800 of us turned up every day, it would be too much for us all to scrutinise properly. And that's why I think, the work that Lord Norton was talking about of the Constitution Committee and those delegated legislation, secondary legislation committees is so important. And I think we still have work to do to maximise the influence we're able to have on these very important laws that fly under the radar.
There are two, on the actual question about the bill, yes, I'd come at it from a point of view not having strong views either way on Brexit. My concern is Parliament and the position of Parliament, and it really should be Parliament that decides, and the bill is giving too much to ministers to really decide. So by order could get rid of something that is massive and really demands parliamentary time and consideration. So it should not be rushed. It really needs to be Parliament to go through it in detail to decide whether those particular provisions should or should not be retained or amended and so on. So I think on that point, yes, it's designed to strengthen the executive and not Parliament. On Lord Anderson's point, I was arguing in the chamber the other day on delegated legislation that, we do have the power to reject. We're a bit reluctant to use it, and I think that's not a good thing. We should be prepared to use it. There's no reason why we shouldn't reject a statutory instrument, because it's government says, it's a fatal motion if you try and reject it. Well, it's only fatal.
But isn't the trouble that the power is too strong because it's not subject to the Parliament Act? So if we reject it, the Commons can't say we're wrong like it could with a bill. It would just have gone.
But if we,
so isn't it too
there's a major difference, because if we reject a bill on second reading, we're killing it for the session. Yeah. If we're rejecting a statutory instrument, we're killing it until the next day. The government can simply relay it with a word change. They can just keep coming back at it. So it's not a nuclear option. It's just saying go away, bring it back, take on board. If we kept rejecting it, that might be slightly different, but it's not happened. So they could go away, come back with it. So I think we need to be tougher, because we've got committees we've set up that examine delegated legislation. Yes. There's no point in having them if we're not then prepared to act on the basis of what they're telling us about those. Well, I think we should. We'd have to have...
Do Labour ever support a fatal motion? I know the Lib Dems do, but do Labour ever support fatal motion?
I've heard it talked about in dark corridors, but
So the
no,
answer is no.
I've not experienced it, but I believe they've happened in the past.
Oh, that we've done it before, yeah, and the House has asserted its right to do it. It's perfectly entitled to do it. I mean, the point I made in the chamber, there's no point giving a committee the power to bark if the House itself is not prepared to bite. And I think that's really what we've got to
move on to the next question, I'm afraid, but excellent one though. Look, we've got a great discussion going on that one. Let's move on to a question again submitted by Trinity Sixth Form College in Halifax, Warrington and Vale College and Connell Co-op College in Manchester. And they'd like to know, how does the House of Lords provide effective checks on the government when it has few powers and can ultimately be bypassed using the Parliament Act? So interesting one there. We'll just hear from two members on this one, if that's okay, to get through as many questions as we can. If I could come first to maybe Lady Wilcox, would you like to share any views on that one?
It's a difficult. I mean, we've talked so much about what we can do. You know, there's a kind of a negativity inherent in this question about what we can't do. You know, as I said, I'm a relatively newcomer here, so I'm still very positive about things. So I don't really, I'm not really aware of the whys and wherefores, but I think that we do find ways around things. And I thought it was very interesting what we said earlier on about discussions that can take place outside. You know, so I think informally and, you know, a meeting with the ministers, that's a really powerful tool.
Oh, sorry. Well, let's start from the Parliament Act end, because everybody says, oh, there's the Parliament Act. Don't forget that since the 1949 Parliament Act, it's only been used 4 times. There's only been 4 measures that have gone through under the Provisions of Act. And 3 of those were on issues that were free vote. So it wasn't, you know, government bills that were causing the problem. So we've got the capacity that we've been discussing, the procedures we've got allows us to scrutinise, to put pressure on government. So I think we do have the tools there, and we need to see it in the way that we've been discussing. So we're not that constricted in terms of what we've been talking about, in terms of scrutinising government, putting it under challenge, getting it to think again.
Thank you very much for that great question. Right, would you like to ask yours?
I had a question for Baroness Gardiner. I was hearing that you were saying earlier that with over 800 members of the House of Lords, a very diverse range of professions and backgrounds, do you reckon 800 is potentially too many and potentially hinders the progression of the House of Lords being able to scrutinise effectively?
I think we all agree it's too many because it is the biggest, you know, one of the biggest parliaments. But the only thing is, as I mentioned earlier, half of them never ever bother to turn up. So there may be 800 members, but I think there are well over 400 who never set foot in the place. So, well, Debbie's suggesting there are 300 who turn up regularly.
Let's say 350, let's split it.
And if they don't turn up, they don't get paid a penny.
Yes. But as I say, they don't cost the country anything because we're not paid and we have no staff. So you can only claim an allowance on the days you attend. But that's not really the argument for it. And so we keep trying to reduce the numbers so that we can reduce it to the people who do actually turn up and do the work. But having all these others, it just looks so bad. You know, it makes us a target for people saying, why have you got 800 peers?
It's a distraction.
It is a distraction. It is a distraction. So, but it's really difficult to find a way to reduce it. And of course, when, you know, the really crucial thing, because when the life peerages came in 1958, that was for the first time ordinary people like me came in, for the first time women came in. And then Tony Blair tried to get rid of all the hereditary peers in 1999, I think, but they struck this deal that 92 of them could stay. And it remains at 92 because they have a mini election if one of them dies. So it's virtually always a man. When I came in, there were actually 2 women hereditary peers, the Countess of Mar, who was formidable, and Lady Saltoun, was she the other one? And they were both Scottish ones, where women can inherit, but that's very, very rare. But actually a lot of the hereditary peers actually really do work very, very hard. I think a lot of them are aware that they are there representing the 1,000 who were cast into outer darkness when they were all thrown out. But no, we could do with a much smaller, you know, a more fit for purpose set of people, I think.
But the question, as Baroness Garden says, is how you get the numbers down. And I think the worst way to get it down, although it is sometimes suggested, is let's have a freeze on recruitment. Because we're old enough already. You know, our average age is 71. You don't want us old fossils getting older and older and older and no new blood coming in. I mean, one very good thing we did, I think history shows that small, sensible reforms of the House of Lords work quite well. And we introduced the ability to retire. And now about 20 peers a year retire. Some of them you're quite pleased they're retiring, and others you wish they'd stayed on a bit longer. But you know, that's a sort of voluntary start. But I think probably you need the party groupings and the crossbenchers sort of collectively. If you're going to reduce the numbers, you know, you've got to head for the top end as well of the age bracket. Yes. And each grouping has to put a bit of pressure somehow on its own members. You know, perhaps the ones that don't turn up as much, or the ones that don't contribute, or the ones that seem to have got a bit tired or old. And sort of prune at that level as well, not just stop new people coming in.
And you get there's those who retired because under the 2014 Act, which is a private members' bill, which some of us were responsible for, it allows peers to retire, which previously they couldn't. And you said that since the Act came in, it runs into over 100. It's into three figures, so the House would have been much bigger now had it not been for that. The Act incidentally gets rid of any peer who doesn't attend for a whole session. Yes. So some of these people clearly turn up for a bit each year. I mean, we could try and amend it to up the level. So we've managed to get it down somewhat. So you've got retirements, of course, then I'm afraid, because of the age factor, you've got deaths as well. So each year, the number would go down if it wasn't for the sheer number of new creations. Yes. So you could reduce it. I mean, in principle, the House favours a chamber no bigger than the House of Commons. And after the 1999 Act that got rid of most hereditary peers, we were roughly the same size as the Commons. It's just been so many creations since. But you could address the problem that Lord Anderson mentioned, so we're not becoming totally stale, by a 2 out, 1 in principle. So for every 2 members you lose, at least the Prime Minister could nominate another one. So it'd be a gradual process. But
and in fact, most of us voted for that a few years ago. And we also voted for single 15-year terms. I hasten to add, we did not vote for those for ourselves, but we voted for those for our successors. But I mean, whether you think that bit's fair or not, I do think that is another possible way to look at it. I mean, why on earth should people be appointed for life? Why shouldn't they be appointed for a term? Which gives them an incentive to really get something done while they're here.
You know, we may be very ancient, but actually some of the ancient ones are the ones who contribute most to the House. And so you don't necessarily want to see people disappearing on the grounds of age, just age. I mean, obviously, if they're losing it, then you hope they'll go, but not just because they happen to have hit 80 or 85. Yes.
And there's also at the other end an argument for not being too small because of the nature of the expertise. Yes. And you need people who still, if you like, doing the day jobs, who can come in and provide their expertise. Yes. The danger is otherwise you just get people who've finished doing something, so they're X. They may still be valuable in contributing, but it's useful to have those who maintain the expertise that are out there.
I'll give you an example. The first bill I witnessed when I came into this place a few years ago was the Ivory Bill. And should we ban the trade in ivory? And of course, we all want to ban the trade in ivory. But when you look into it, it turns out it's quite complicated. I just sat there, I couldn't believe the expertise that was on show. So there was an Indian baroness who told us about the temple elephants that she'd grown up with. There was a former president of Baroness Rawlings, I think, of the Antique Dealers Association, and she knew all about the Asian markets for ivory. There was the Earl of Kinnoul, a hereditary peer, who knows all about insurance, and he told us the insurance aspect. There was even a wonderful crossbench peer who's a composer and musician called Michael Barclay, and he explained that the bows of stringed instruments have in recent years been faced with ivory taken from mammoth tusks from Siberia. And he'd be very reluctant to see that go, because when they've experimented with metal facings, the acoustic quality isn't quite as good. I couldn't think of any other legislative chamber where that particular speech would have been
made. And of course, piano keys tend to be made of ivory, or did in the olden days.
But I mean, my point, I've been slightly frivolous, but the point is not all these people would necessarily be there every day, but you get a bill about something you really know about, and it's actually quite useful, and they're free. You know, you don't have to pay them all the other days they don't turn up, and if they are going to come along and say something useful. There we are. Thank
you very much. And that really picks up nicely on the John Roan School's question and Skipton Girls High School question about hereditary peers. So we've touched on that. So we'll move on to our next question now, which is going to be from St Patrick's School in Dungannon. And that is, what do you consider to be the key achievements of the House of Lords in the current parliamentary session? So we'll hear from 2 members for this one, I think. Shall we come to Lady Wilcox first for your thoughts?
The current parliamentary session, key achievements. Okay, well, it's again, it's holding the government's feet to the fire on what was the bill you talked about, Lord Norton? The borders? Yes, yeah, yes, the borders bill. I mean, you know, and we've had representations from many NGOs, many groups and associations who work with particularly migrant women, you know, we've managed to achieve subtle changes within that. And I think particularly of the session before that, with the domestic violence against women and girls that I was involved with, and we brought 3 or 4 substantial amendments and changes to that to make that a far better law and a much stronger law that will support domestic violence. And it was the non-strangulation.
Yes, suffocation and strangulation. Yeah.
And that is, you know, actually now on in the laws of the land that. You know, that can make life, I mean, it's horrendous, you know, when you see and hear about domestic violence, but to think that we made those changes to ensure that those women are now going to be protected. So the session before perhaps was, you know, more in my timeline.
Thank you very much. Baroness Garden, would you like to share any thoughts on this one?
My mind has gone blank.
No problem at all. That's fine.
My point would be you don't need to come up with discrete examples because in a way it's a constant process.
Yes,
I would say
yes.
because it's a bit like when we're talking about scrutiny, it's not giving an example of scrutiny because that's a constant process. It's every day. You just look at proceedings. What flows from the scrutiny might be an exercise of influence, so there's change, but it's the scrutiny that is ongoing, it's sort of constant.
Yes.
And in a way that's also part of the achievements we have because it's keeping government on their feet, calling them to account. And of course government knows they've got to come to the dispatch box to answer. So that in itself is important. There's an inherent element to it. So I'd say almost every day is an achievement in the sense of getting ministers, they've got to come. So that I say that culture of justification. Now, things may come from it in concrete terms, legislative change, government changing policy, and so on. So you can highlight those, but I'd just say the actual constant process of questioning, debating, keeping ministers coming to explain what they're doing is there, and that's at the heart of what we do, and if you like, that is the achievement.
Let's have another question from in the room. Also, we've got 2, so we'll come to you first, and then we'll come to you afterwards. Go for it.
What do you think it means for our already unentrenched, uncodified constitution now that the government has blocked the Scottish bill to legally recognise trans people at the age of 16?
I don't think they've blocked it yet, have they? It's on its way, but I think the intention is, I live in a country that has its own devolved government, and I believe very clearly that if we have a devolved government in Wales and in Scotland, and they make those laws, then those laws should be respected by the UK government, whatever they are, and the other way around.
It's a problem every country has, every federal country has. You can give powers to the states, or you can acknowledge that the states already have those powers, but there will come a point where the state powers might conflict with the federal law, and at that point you need some mechanism for sorting it out, and that's what this Section 35 is all about. The British government says, whether it's right or not, I don't know, but they say probably this gender recognition bill is it gets in the way of the operation of the Equalities Act, which is a United Kingdom Act, and therefore under the devolution settlement with Scotland takes precedence. Now, I've absolutely no doubt that at the end of the day that will have to be sorted out in the Supreme Court, but I think it's an absolutely legitimate question to ask, because we are still a United Kingdom. We do have very significant devolved powers, but there will always be areas of conflict, and I think it's right that you should be able to sort them out politically, but in those cases where you can't, I think you do need a Supreme Court that can make the judgment.
But Section 35's never been used yet?
No, not yet. It's always been resolved by politicians before now, which is the ideal.
So 24 years in, it's never been used?
But it's nothing to do with the fact of having an uncodified constitution, because it's actually a statutory provision that was put there in the first place, and the government would argue that's why.
They have exactly the same problems in the US. I mean, look at the abortion thing. I mean, should that be something left for the states, or should that be something that the federal government decides for everybody? This big debate they've had in the US. You have the same thing in Australia, in Canada, in Germany, in any sort of federally constituted state.
Thank you very much. Really good question. Would you like to go ahead?
Do you think it's still appropriate to have Church of England bishops on the Lords, considering the recent census results for England and Wales?
Oh gosh, that really is. Of course, it goes back to the trouble is, they've been there since the 14th century or whatever. Of course, they weren't Church of England in the 14th century, but so they have changed that one. But it still is the state church, even though we know the numbers are dwindling. And the bishops do, and we always start with 5 minutes of prayers, so there's always a duty bishop, and of course the Commons always starts with 5 minutes of prayers as well. But by and large, and the bishops all have areas that they zone in on. So there's one who's agriculture, there's another for education, and so on. And they do contribute a lot to the debates when they do speak, because you don't get to be a bishop without seeing an awful lot of life in the raw. And they tend to be, really quite humane people. And so I think they do contribute, but you're quite right. But the fact is that we have members of all other faiths in the Lords, but the Church of England bishops are the only ones there by entitlement.
You've got 26 bishops, Church of England bishops, guaranteed.
I know you've got 20. Yes, you have. Yes, you have. But of course, they've all got bishoprics to run. So I mean, they only turn up when they're on duty, or if there is a bill for which they are responsible. So we don't see a load of bishops all the time. But when they do, and their contributions, whenever they make contributions in debates, they're always thoughtful. So I don't think I don't think they detract from us. And, while it is still the national church, the Church of England, I think probably there is a role for them. But like all of these things, it's incredibly difficult to undo something that's been in place for hundreds of years.
That would need an act of parliament, wouldn't it, to get rid of the bishops? I'm afraid I'm a member of the Church of England. I'm dead against them. I mean, everyone likes them. Everyone likes them. That's why everyone's so kind. And they also have the advantage they have to retire at 70, so they don't get too old. And they're getting more and more gender diverse. And they are sensible when they open their mouths. I don't think that's good enough reason to guarantee 26 places in your legislature for clerics, which is something no other country does except for Iran. I'm all for distinguished clerics, former clerics of whatever faith, finding their way in by other means as crossbenchers. I think the time has passed when 26 Church of England bishops have that place as of right, I'm afraid. But I know that's an unpopular view within the House of Lords. There is great affection for the bishops, and if I were foolish enough ever to try and put that to the vote, I would be roundly defeated.
Thank you. Really good question. Yeah, well done. So we'll move on to a question submitted by Woodhouse Grove School in Yorkshire, Stafford Grammar School, Lismore Comprehensive School in Northern Ireland, and Outward Post-16 Centre in Worksop. So I'm going to change this one ever so slightly and ask each of the panellists to describe one way that they would like to reform the House of Lords in about 10 seconds. Okay, so that's the challenge. I'll start with Lady Wilcox.
Okay, the hours. We work unsociable hours, we work unfriendly family hours. We need to sort the hours out. It's ridiculous starting in the afternoon and working till midnight. We should, the Welsh Government work family-friendly hours. We should follow that pattern.
Thank you very much. Lord Anderson.
I'm going to steal Lord Norton's thunder by saying I would support his bill, which would put the Appointments Commission on a statutory basis and give them the right to vet anyone that a Prime Minister put forward for appointment to see whether they were a fit and proper person. I'd also find some way of equalising the representation of the parties. It so happens at the moment we have about a third Conservative, a third Labour and Lib Dem, a quarter crossbenchers. That works quite well. But there's nothing to stop any Prime Minister packing the House with 50 of his or her cronies. And I don't think that's acceptable. There has to be a way of stopping it.
Thank you very much. Baroness Garden.
Well, I absolutely agree. I think the appointments thing really needs to be looked at. I think that would be a major advantage if it was taken out of the hands of the Prime Minister of the day. And I do entirely agree with Debbie that as she's sitting there at 10 o'clock, because sometimes I'm on the Woolsack from 10 till 11, or we go on from 11 to 12 sometimes, and it really is, you're not at your best at that time, so we need to sort that out, but it's incredibly difficult to get any changes like that through the majority of the House, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, amazingly enough, at the top of my list is passing my House of Lords Peerage Nominations bill, which would address some of the issues that have been identified and really gets at the issue of public trust.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Now that brings us to our final question, and we don't have very much time left, so it's going to be a quick one. This one is from Christopher Whitehead Language College in Worcester, and it's, if you could pick anyone in history to have tea with, who would you pick? But I'm going to change it slightly and say anyone in political history to have tea with, who would you pick? So I just want a name and a bit of an explanation if none of us have heard of them, if that's okay. So I will go to Baroness
Well,
Garden.
before you said political, because I had thought of somebody like Queen Victoria, or preferably Prince Albert, because he was a bit like Prince Philip. He was ahead of his time. He was fascinated by art and technology, and I thought they would be really interesting. But they weren't. Well, I suppose they're sort of political. You know, I mean, you know, they put up this place, so I suppose that's.
We'll give you that one.
Will you give me that one? Okay, right.
Lord Anderson.
If you go to Temple Church, which is 2 tube stops that way, you'll see the effigy of William Marshall, who rose from absolutely nothing to be a great tournament champion and an advisor to 4 English kings. The culmination of his career was negotiating Magna Carta between King John and the barons. I'd love to have met him. Not sure he would have drunk tea. I'm not sure he'd heard of tea, but I'd love the chance to have met him.
I would like to have met an Irene Bevan, who was a very famous Welsh Member of Parliament and who was the inspiration for the National Health Service. He was the Member of Parliament for Tredegar and Ebbw Vale and, you know, the north there. And yeah, I just would have said, how did you do it in Irene? Because it was a fantastic achievement to bring public medicine into our society, and we must protect it at all costs.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. So thank you firstly to our fantastic panellists for sharing all of your views and answering all of those questions. Thank all of you from Benton Park for your fantastic questions, and to all of you for submitting such fantastic questions too. We would love to know what you thought of today's session. So there's just a survey being dropped into the chat as we speak. If you could just fill that in for us, we would really appreciate it. Do share any photos you took on social media. You can find us at UK Parl Education, and we really look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much. Goodbye.